I want us to begin by looking at the general revelation of God. And I want us to turn this morning to Matthew chapter number 5. Matthew chapter number 5, our series we've entitled Theology, Right Thinking for Right Living. And we've already observed the importance of theology in our first lesson, where we examined two central questions. What is it, and why do I need it? And the nature of theology, as we've already seen, is the study about God. And clearly, I think that in and of itself would establish its value. The importance of it is seen in the reality that the way that I think is indicative of the way that I'm going to live my life. My beliefs, as we've already observed, form the basis of my convictions. My convictions form the basis of my decisions, and my decisions then form the basis of my actions. Proverbs 23, verse 7, as he thinketh in his heart, so is he. And the context of that particular verse is found where God is describing a wicked man with an evil eye. And he is an individual who is to be avoided. However, I believe the principle of Proverbs 23:7 is applicable to both godly and ungodly individuals. So the importance of theology, I would say, cannot be underestimated. And we asked another question in a second lesson: why study it? Well, that still was in the first one. It's a study about God, and it is a study that is worthy of our minds. And if you have studied much, specifically just said, okay, well, I want to try to figure out what the Bible says about God, let me just tell you there's a lot. And I'll also say this, that you're never going to comprehend it all. And about the time that you think you're getting somewhere, you'll realize, I don't even know that you've put a scratch into the surface of who God truly is. And so our minds get directed on who He is. It formulates the basis of godly actions. It's vital that we develop a biblical worldview that centers everything around God and everything around who He is. The second lesson that we saw was pertaining to the knowability of God. And the question that we asked was this: can I know God? If we're incapable of knowing God, then what's the point? Are we engaged in a study that has no value? Are we pursuing someone that we can never know? Well, we noted that the reality that the knowledge of God is innate. It is something that every individual possesses. It also passes the test. In order to be innate, it passes the test of universality and necessity. We examined both of those as well, and then we saw that the knowledge of God is incomprehensible. We'll never be able to comprehend all that there is to know about God, but we don't want to just end on a negative note, and we saw that the knowledge of God is also possible. And so it's a pursuit that ought to occupy the minds of every single believer. We begin this morning and we look at the revelation of God, and we've established the importance and the necessity of studying it. We've established the possibility of knowing God. Now the question is this: how do we know God? How did God choose to reveal Himself? Because if we can talk about the idea of knowing God, and we can talk about all of the theory out there, but if we don't identify the means by which God can be known, we're once again faced with the reality of a study that in all practical purposes would have little practical value. If I can talk in a theory about knowing God, but then how do I know God? If God can be known, and there's no doubt about that, He can be known, then we have to examine the means by which He can be known. All of theology, we say, rests on two basic premises. The fact is, God exists. We've identified this as a reality that is innate to every human, and we also find a second one, and that is this: God has spoken. What we know about God, we know because God has chosen to reveal it to us. That's the only reason we know it. There may be things God never chose to reveal. In fact, there probably are. But there are, what we know about God, we know because God has chosen to reveal it. And so we have to examine the content of the revelation, what the avenue of how God chose to do this, so that then we can come to a better understanding of the nature of God. I want to begin by identifying a definition of revelation. We sometimes use this word very loosely, and it ends up creating some confusion. We'll maybe be reading our Bibles and we'll say, well, God revealed this to me this morning. Well, no, not exactly. God revealed it a long time ago, and it's in the pages of the Word of God. Your light bulb went off this morning, okay? That's not revelation, that's illumination, and the two things are totally different concepts. Don't get them confused. Sometimes we're praying for something and we'll say, well, God revealed the answer. God directed your mind towards the answer, but it's not the same thing as revealing it. And so we don't want to be sloppy in our terminology. We want to be very clear in what we're talking about. Here's what we mean by revelation. It is the act whereby God communicated truth to man. Fairly simple, but I have to add a second point to it. Truth which otherwise could not have been known by man. If God had not chosen to act, mankind would be incapable of knowing God. This truth is incapable of being known any other way when it comes to the matter of God. So we're not just simply describing something that's difficult to understand for some. No, we're saying these are truths that could never have been known by God if God hadn't chosen to act. Thank God that He chose to act. Thank God for His grace and thank God for His mercy, because He has chosen to act and He has chosen to reveal these certain things about us. And there are avenues, two avenues specifically, by which God has chosen to reveal Himself. And these two avenues basically form the means to achieve these two premises. General revelation, which is what we'll talk about here this morning, establishes the fact that God exists. It is necessary because not everyone, even though it's an innate knowledge, and we talked about that, not everyone necessarily realizes that they possess it, the innate knowledge of it. And so it's important that we examine this general revelation. But there's also then special revelation. We're not going to get to that this morning. And that is this idea that God has spoken. And there are different terms sometimes that are used for both of these. But that's going to be the two terms that we're going to choose to use. Now, what we're saying is that both general and special revelation are clearly known from God. The definition that we've already examined asserts that revelation is communication of truth by God to man, truth which otherwise could not have been known. Both general and special revelation are about God. And it's the avenue by which He chose to reveal Himself. Let's begin by noticing the nature of general revelation. And I know this is going to be rocket science here. It's general. Okay? It's not specific. It's general in several areas. First of all, it's general in its scope. Let's turn, and if you haven't already, to Matthew chapter number 5. Jesus is in the Sermon on the Mount, and towards the end of Matthew 5, he's into a section of, beginning back in verse 21, you've heard this, but I say unto you this. He is not contradicting the Old Testament. He is contradicting the interpretation of the Old Testament. The rabbis and the Pharisees had come along and had misinterpreted things. And they had misled the children of Israel. And so God is establishing the proper standard. Part of that is in this idea of loving a neighbor and hating your enemy. No, nowhere in the Scripture does it ever teach that we are allowed to hate our enemies. It is taught, however, that you are to love your neighbor. Well, the Jews interpreted that as meaning we are to love fellow Jews. Therefore, anybody who is not a fellow Jew must be an enemy. And God told us to destroy all of them when we went into the promised land. Really what God means is love your neighbor, you can hate your enemy. Obviously, that's not a correct interpretation, and he straightens this out, verse 44. But I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you, that ye may be the children of your Father which is in heaven. You don't become this, you demonstrate that you are this by your actions. Notice the end of verse 45. For he maketh his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and he sendeth rain on the just and on the unjust. What we find is that this general revelation is general in its scope. All mankind, regardless of their culture, regardless of their sex, regardless of their geographical location, regardless of the age in which they lived, have experienced these kind of truths. They are truths that are available to both saved and unsaved, although the unsaved may not acknowledge God in these various events. The unsaved and saved have both been the beneficiaries of sunshine. Same thing is true of rain. Do they recognize it as always coming from God? No. But every age, every culture, male, female, doesn't matter where you are, you've been the recipient of these things. We might emphasize, oh, we sure have been the recipients of a whole lot of rain. And we most definitely have. But yet you still have sunshine because it is still light outside. Okay? God does these things on the just and on the unjust. These are not limited only to the good, but it also includes the evil. Let's turn over to a second passage, and that is Acts chapter 14 and verse 17. Paul is preaching here. And this is another one that's going to establish this reality that general revelation is general in its scope. Paul is ministering here in Lystra. And there was an individual who was lame, and Paul went to him and said to stand up, and he leapt. He actually, the Bible says in verse 10 that he leaped and walked, and everyone saw this, and they said, wow, Paul and Barnabas are gods. Let's call, I'm trying to remember which, Barnabas was Jupiter and Paul was Mercurius. And they started worshiping them. And Paul said, whoa, 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 stop. I wonder what modern mankind would do if they had received these kinds of miracles. Sometimes it seems as though preachers improperly elevate themselves and accept man's worship. And they're very clear, no, don't do this. We are just like you. But let me tell you about God, the God, who according to verse number 15, I think it's verse 15. Well, yeah, let me pick it up, verse 15. 17 is the phrase that I'm wanting. He's saying, sirs, why do ye these things? We also are men of like passions with you, and preach unto you that ye should turn from these vanities unto the living God, which made heaven and earth and the sea and all things that are therein, who in times past suffered all nations to walk in their own ways. Nevertheless, he left not himself without witness, in that he did good, gave us rain from heaven and fruitful seasons, filling our hearts with food and gladness. You know, even the unsaved are the recipients of God's blessing. Amen. You know, unsaved people are in hospitals and they experience the joy of being healed. There are unsaved people who have had very successful crops and have enjoyed the privileges of eating. They may not attribute these things to God, but they should. These are an avenue of general revelation. It's general in its scope. We would say then that general revelation is all-inclusive. Everybody across the spectrum, everyone who's ever been born, currently living, or ever will be born, they are all the beneficiaries of general revelation. It's all-inclusive. Secondly, we note that general revelation is general in its geography. Psalm chapter number 19, if you'd like to turn there, you may want to put a marker there. We'll be back here in just a little bit. But in Psalm 19, a wonderful psalm as David reflects on heaven and the glory that creation shows. We say it's general in its geography. What we're saying is it encompasses the entire earth. God didn't just reveal himself to the Jews. And incidentally, God didn't just reveal himself to America. We tend to think ourselves a whole lot higher in the grand scheme of empires than God does, all right? And so, but God did not just reveal himself to the Jews. Psalm chapter 19, verse 1, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament show his handiwork. Day unto day uttereth speech, and night unto night showeth knowledge. There is a revelation that is given to all individuals that encompasses God's creation. Day unto day, it utters this speech. Night unto night, it shows, it demonstrates this knowledge. It is a revelation that is given to all individuals, but I also need to understand that it is a revelation, thirdly, that is sufficient to condemn. Romans chapter number 1, the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness, wickedness of men who hold the truth rather in unrighteousness. They suppress it in unrighteousness. Why? Because that which may be known of God is manifest in them, for God hath shown it unto them. For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal and power and Godhead. Here's the reason, or the conclusion rather, so that they are without excuse. Does that mean they won't offer excuses? No. But they do not have a valid excuse to reject this. So it is sufficient. Its nature clearly, as rocket science as this seems, suggests that it is general. And while it is general, and there are those who would suggest that you could respond theoretically to general revelation and be saved, I disagree with that premise, because there's nothing in there that talks about sin. There's nothing in there that talks about Christ. There's nothing in there that talks about salvation, the work of Christ, none of that. So I do not see that an individual just automatically can be saved on general revelation. What can happen, however, is that individual chooses to respond to that light, and he is given additional light. And that light, if he continues to respond, will eventually lead to salvation. But I do not believe that a person could walk outside, look up into the sky, and say, wow, there must be a God. Wherever you are, I'm yours, and now think he's saved. That just does not fit the gospel, the definition of the gospel, and it does not fit the nature of really what we're dealing with when it comes to revelation. Well, let me begin to look at the methods of general revelation, because there are aspects where God has chosen to reveal himself, and we say, well, how has he done so? And it produces sufficient knowledge to those who reject it, and there are some methods two methods primarily that we'll look at. One is creation and one is the conscience. But I want us to establish some arguments that oftentimes are used for the existence of God. And I'm going to say to a little bit, or to an extent, we're going to get a little philosophical, although it's not going to get extremely deep either. But there are some solid evidences that we can establish for the existence of God. How do we do this? How do we reason through this? And if you ever have heard of the term apologetics, it doesn't mean that we are apologizing, but what it means is we're defending the faith. And the Bible teaches that as Christians, we ought to be capable of doing that. How do we know God exists? What can you and I use to demonstrate that God exists? Just talking to an ordinary individual without getting out all of the theology books and the books on philosophy. And I can assure you these arguments all go in much greater depth than what we're going to take them into. We're going to kind of barely scratch the surface and hopefully cover them fairly quickly. There are three arguments that we're going to point to that will help us to establish the existence of God. One of them is what we call the cosmological argument. It's found in two passages, Psalm 19 and Romans chapter 1. This argument pertains to the matter of creation and how it attests to the fact that there is a God. And so the argument, and this has been around for a long time. In fact, this argument actually could even be dated all the way back into the Middle Ages. But it has two basic premises followed by a conclusion. Premise one is this: everything that has a beginning has a cause. It's important that you don't just say everything has a cause, because that includes God. Everything that has a beginning. Those few little words right there are extremely important. Everything that has a beginning has a cause. This isn't too complicated to understand. The pew that you are sitting in there, somebody created, somebody designed that pew. You might think, well, I've got some ideas for that person, okay? He should have added some additional back support. He should have added some lumbar cushions. He should have added a valve that we could just inflate the air in the back of various locations, okay? But still, it had a beginning. Therefore, it has to have a cause. Second premise is this: the universe has a beginning. Therefore, we would say the conclusion is this: the universe has a cause. Now, here's what we begin to look at. If we say that everything has a beginning, then we put God into that category. We have a logical inconsistency. So all that we're dealing with then is the universe. The universe had to have had a beginning. It doesn't. Everyone's fairly well in agreement with this. Even unsaved people are in agreement with this. Even an atheist agrees. The universe has a beginning. Now, his idea of how this came to be is different. Okay? But it clearly had a beginning. And we can look at this scientifically. You've probably heard, maybe you remember, the second law of thermodynamics. It says this, basically: the universe is running out of energy. Now, we don't have to look at the universe. Look at your body. It's running out of energy. Every person who has matured in life has said, man, I wish I could go back and harness that energy that I had 20 years ago, or 30 years ago, or 60 years ago, or 70 years ago. All right, we're going to stop there. But we wish we could go back and harness that energy. Take something and begin letting it roll. Eventually, it's going to come to a stop. Everything is running. We're running out of energy. And even the evolutionists acknowledge that the universe had a beginning. They just say the universe had an explosion. By the way, there are some Christians who are starting to adopt this same philosophy that say that God was the one who caused the explosion. Need to be very careful about that. They point to the suddenness of things. Now think about this biblically. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. There can be the suddenness without suggesting that God is behind a big bang. I think that we are starting to kind of compromise in ways we shouldn't be compromising. But it has a beginning. So it's logical then to conclude that the universe has a cause. Now, that doesn't necessarily prove the existence of God. But it does prove that the cause has to exist in a realm outside of that universe. It couldn't have created it. Everything that you and I see has a beginning, so the cause has to exist in a realm outside of something that has a beginning. The cause is eternal. Well, it sure does point towards the fact of there being a God, doesn't it? Because nothing else in there is going to be able to explain how this cause came to be if there were not someone existing outside of this realm before it ever came to place. Genesis chapter 1, in the beginning, God. That's it. He was already there. And we can go on and on and on and point to things, but the nature of what we see would suggest he had to have existed prior to it, has to exist in a realm outside of it, and he has to be some kind of powerful to produce everything that we see. Nobody in their right mind would look and say, wow, that was a brilliant monkey. It makes no sense. Okay? Boy, I sure did create a great world, didn't I? Everybody in this room knows I didn't create it. Look at the mess we would all be in if I had attempted to create it. I can look at various things that I have attempted to create that look good in my mind that didn't look so good in reality. Sometimes it was food, and I'm thinking, wow, yeah, this shouldn't be that bad. And then what comes out wasn't what went in or wasn't what was pictured in the mind. Yeah, we're not eating this. Let's order a pizza. This is disgusting. And we all know this. This is the reality. We can look at multiple passages. Psalm 19, one that I've already mentioned briefly. Romans chapter 1, same thing is going to be established there. The invisible things of Him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even His eternal power and Godhead. Creation tells us about His eternal power and His Godhead. Psalm chapter 19, the heavens declare the glory of God. The firmament showeth His handiwork. The design and everything about this, the universe, the message that goes throughout all the earth from the universe is God has revealed Himself. And interesting, maybe not everyone's capable of seeing the sunlight, but everyone's capable of feeling the heat from the sun. Okay? And so where did it come from? And this is the focus of general revelation. Romans chapter number 1, and I don't have a whole lot of time to get into this, but God has chosen these methods of creation to reveal His eternal power and Godhead. However, these individuals chose to reject that knowledge, and they, verse 21, glorified Him not as God. Therefore, the Bible teaches that they incurred God's wrath. God, according to verse 24, gave them up unto uncleanness. They continued to defy God, and eventually, verse 28, God gave them over to a reprobate mind. What happened? They chose to reject the revelation that creation indicates. This argument, everything that has a beginning has a cause. The universe has a beginning, therefore the universe has a cause. What is that cause? Well, we can point to the Word of God and establish that it's God. There's another argument, don't care that you know the term necessarily to it, called the teleological or the order argument. And here is what we mean by this. Once again, two premises followed by a conclusion. Every design has a designer. The universe has a highly complex design. Therefore, the universe has a designer. Somebody decided to design the jacket you wore today. It didn't just magically poof into existence. Some of what is popular in today's design world, I look at scratching my head. Artwork that is put out in yards of public buildings that, it's some sort of a circle. It's like, wow, okay. Some places you go and it looks like it's rusted to pieces, and it's like, wow, that's just beautiful artwork, okay. And it is to somebody. I probably do not have that artistic view. I can look at paintings and pictures and not see the same thing everyone else sees. And it's just, I guess, maybe a bad thing that I have. Well, don't you see the beauty of that? And I'm looking at it. No, but my eyesight's really struggling today. What are you supposed to say to this? Don't you think this is beautiful? It is a work of art, okay? And we are supposed to value art for art's sake. All right, well, every design has a designer. Well, the universe has a highly complex design. Here's just some rather amazing figures. Scientists have attested to the reality of the complexity of a human cell. It's amazing. Look at everything with cancer and the study into cells that has gone on. And good cells and bad cells and white blood cells and red blood cells and which ones are attacking which ones. And then you get one bad cell and he's just wreaking havoc. It's amazing the complexity of a single human cell. The universe has been perfectly designed in such a manner as to be suitable for life. The oxygen level is 21% of the atmosphere. 21. If it increased slightly, we would all blow up. If it decreased, we would all suffocate. 21%. Wow, that's a magical chance, isn't it? Who'd have thunk that would have happened? Gravitational force can't be altered slightly without devastating effects. The universe is a highly complex design. Therefore, the universe has a designer. Psalm 19, a verse we've already read. Day unto day uttereth speech, night unto night showeth knowledge. Paul in Acts 14, Sir, why do ye these things? We're men of like passions, just like with you. We preach unto you that you should turn from these vanities unto the living God, which made heaven and earth and the sea and all things that are therein. And there are some miraculous creatures in this world. How they are perfectly suited for the environment in which they live. It's amazing. Who in times past suffered all nations to walk in their own ways. Nevertheless, he left not himself without witness, in that he did good and gave us rain from heaven and fruitful seasons, filling our hearts with food and gladness. Have you paid attention just to the water cycle and how all that works? It's amazing. Okay? Who did that? God. One more argument that is used to establish the existence of God is what is termed as the anthropological argument. The word anthropological is from the Greek word anthropos, which means mankind, human. And sometimes, and it takes different arguments. Sometimes they'll say it from the standpoint of mankind being created in the image of God, Genesis chapter 1, 26 and 27. Paul, let's turn over to Acts 17. Let me point this one out. Acts 17, we studied recently in Genesis. Man was created in the very image of God. And that's been a question that has kind of puzzled many people, but I want us to notice verses 28 and 29 of Acts chapter 17, because Paul uses that argument from Genesis 1, and he establishes this. All right, he says in verse 28, in him, in God, we live and move and have our being. As certain also of your own poets have said, for we also are his offspring. Forasmuch then as we are the offspring of God, we ought not to think that the Godhead is like unto gold or silver or stone or graven by art and man's device. Mankind was made in the image of God, and it would suggest that God is a living and intelligent being, not some figure of gold or stone or anything like that. It suggests that God has to be a living and an intelligent being. We find in Romans chapter number 2 a second aspect, and I didn't put this on the slide for some reason, and I'm sorry for that. The second aspect, not only does creation show that there's a God, but man's conscience shows there's a God. Romans chapter 2. Paul is writing in the first 3 chapters of Romans, and he's establishing the fact that all mankind are sinners. Every single person is a sinner. There is the really, really bad person, and there is the person who thinks himself to be moral. That's the focus of Romans 2. How did they think themselves to be moral? They did things that they thought they should do. Romans chapter 2, verse 14, the Bible says, for when the Gentiles, which have not the law, do by nature the things contained in the law, these having not the law are a law unto themselves. The Gentiles were not the recipients of God's law. The Jews were. So when the Gentiles act in a manner that is consistent with the law that God gave the Jews, where did they get that idea from? They are a law unto themselves. Verse 15, which demonstrate the work of the law that is written in their hearts. Amen. Their conscience also bearing witness, and their thoughts the meanwhile accusing or else excusing one another. Even unsaved people think, I ought not do that. Now, they might go ahead and do it, but they think, I shouldn't do that. Sometimes they continue to do what's wrong and their conscience gets hard. God, by the way, can still break that conscience. Okay? But they demonstrate a natural tendency to want to do what is right. Now, their definitions of right and all that may vary. But it points to the fact of God. So general revelation, yes, we can use these arguments. God's shown himself in creation, number one. God's shown himself in conscience, number two. Every single person who has ever been born is able to attest to the reality of creation. We talked about some arguments. And is able to attest to the reality of their conscience. Where did those things come from? That's the question that individual has to answer. We find what is the value, thirdly, of general revelation very quickly. Number one, general revelation displays God's grace. Man chose to rebel against God and against God's plan. But aren't you thankful that God still chose to reveal himself? You can imagine if after Adam and Eve sinned, God said, you know what, fine. I created two people and they messed up. Oh well. Maybe you've done that with your children. Well, I guess you'll never know what I bought you, will you? Okay? Why? Because they're acting out or whatever the case might be. But you know, God didn't do that. God has a world that has chosen to reject him. But God has still chosen to reveal himself to that same world. It displays his grace. Secondly, it provides solid arguments for the existence of God. We use these things from an apologetic standpoint to defend the faith and to prove, you know what, God does exist. Do we have to know all of the terms? No, but I'll tell you what, if you can keep 4 passages, 5 passages in mind. Psalm 19, Matthew 5, Acts 14, Romans 1, and Romans 2. You've got it. Those are the passages. Get there. Psalm 19, Acts 14, Romans 1, Romans 2, and Matthew 5. Those 5 passages bring you right to these same things. Can you go through it as though you were in a debate with a world-renowned atheist? Possibly not. But you might be able to talk to your coworker that God does exist. And therefore, he's going to be accountable to him one day. It provides solid arguments for the existence of God. Thirdly, it is sufficient to condemn mankind. Romans 1 makes it very clear that creation reveals enough about God that they are without excuse. Creation alone. How do they explain these things? The world says it was an explosion. Boom, and all this order came into being. Some that I would disagree with say God's the author of that explosion. I think you're trying to split a fence you ought to stay off of personally, all right? You don't split an electric fence, by the way, okay? It's one thing to sit on a wooden fence. It's another thing to sit on an electric one. I don't know that we're doing a very good thing. They talk about the suddenness, and I listened to a lot of arguments about this fairly recently, and the thing they kept coming back to was the suddenness of everything. And I thought, well, that's explained by God said, let there be, and then there was. But there's no indication that God said, let there be all of creation at the same time, and it all came about. It came about over a period of 6 literal 24-hour days. And those are things that I think some are just being sloppy in their interpretation of things. But does God exist? Yes. Creation and conscience. Psalm 19, Matthew 5, Acts 14, Romans 1, Romans 2. God exists. But let me remind you, your loved one, your neighbor, your coworker, your family member is without excuse. We ought to be fervently praying that God works in their hearts.